The asphalt of Interstate 90, cutting through the desolate plains of Montana, was not just a road. It was a black scar stretching into infinity, indifferent to the suffering of those who walked it. The wind howled with a glacial fury, carrying the prelude to an early winter storm, biting into the exposed skin of Nancy Lopez. She was 29 years old, but the reflection she had glimpsed in a gas station restroom window 3 days ago showed a woman who looked 40, her eyes hollowed out by a type of exhaustion that sleep could not cure. Nancy was not used to being the victim. For 7 years, she had been the savior, a decorated firefighter with the elite, trained to walk into infernos that terrified ordinary men. But fire was an honest enemy, had rules, it had physics. Life, Nancy had learned the hard way, was far more chaotic and cruel. She adjusted the straps of her heavy tactical backpack, the only remnant of her former life, but a real burden end. Her only reason for taking another step was pressed against her chest in a worn carrier. Jacob, 3 years old, was sleeping fitfully, his small face buried in the fleece of her jacket, shielding himself from the biting cold. They had been walking for 2 days since the old sedan she had bought with her last savings had died 40 miles back, the transmission grinding into a metallic death rattle that sounded like the end of the world. Nancy had no one to call. The fire that had ended her career 6 months ago had taken more than just the strength in her left leg. It had taken her husband, Mark, who had been her captain, her partner, and the anchor of her reality. Since the funeral, the debts from Mark's experimental treatments had swallowed the house, the insurance money, and eventually, her dignity. She was walking toward Billings, chasing a rumor of a cousin who might have a couch, but her leg was throbbing with a dull, sickening ashi, a reminder of the beam that had crushed it. Every step was a negotiation with pain. She looked down at Jacob, his blonde curls matted under a knit cap. He was too light. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 48 hours, surviving on crackers and the last of a jar of peanut butter. The shame of it burned hotter than any forest fire she had ever fought. She, who had carried grown men out of burning buildings, could not carry her own son to safety. A sleek black Range Rover swept past them, the rush of air nearly knocking Nancy off balance. She didn't even look up. She had stopped hoping for charity miles ago. But then, red taillights flared in the gray dusk. The car slowed, pulled onto the gravel shoulder 100 yards ahead, and waited. Nancy hesitated. Her training told her to assess the threat-isolated road, vulnerable position, unknown subject, but the cold was seeping into Jacob's bones, and desperation had a way of silencing tactical caution. She limped forward, her hand instinctively going to the small pocket knife clipped to her belt. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a thick wool coat that cost more than Nancy had made in a year, with dark hair graying at the temples and a posture that spoke of money and power. But as Nancy got closer, she saw his eyes. They were dark blue like the bottom of a frozen lake, and filled with a haunted, ancient sadness that she recognized instantly. It was the 1,000-yard stare. She had seen it on survivors sitting in the ashes of their homes. This man was a ghost in a rich man's suit. "You look like you're about to collapse," the man said, his voice deep and rough, carrying over the wind. He wasn't looking at her like a predator. He was looking at Jacob with a terrifying intensity. "Get in." Nancy's pride warred with her survival instinct, but a shiver racked Jacob Essie small buddy, deciding for her. "I don't have money to pay you," she said, her voice raspy from dehydration. "I didn't ask for money," he replied, opening the back door. The interior was warm, smelling of expensive leather and faint cedar. As Nancy unbuckled Jacob and slid into the seat, the heat hit her like a physical blow, making her dizzy. The man got back in the driver's seat and looked at her in the rearview mirror. "I'm Matthew." Nancy stiffened. Everyone in the state knew that name. Gonzalez was a tech mogul who had retreated to a massive ranch in the valley 5 years ago, a recluse known for his philanthropy and his absolute refusal to be seen in public. "Nancy," she managed. They drove in silence for 20 minutes until they reached a roadside diner that looked like an oasis of neon in the gathering dark. Matthew insisted on buying them dinner. Inside, under the harsh fluorescent lights, the disparity between them was stark. Matthew sat sipping black coffee, watching Nancy cut up pancakes for Jacob with trembling hands. He noticed the burn scar on her forearm, the way she scanned the room for exits, the tactical boots that were worn down to the heel. "You were on the job," he stated, nodding at the faded patch on her backpack. Nancy nodded, not looking up. "Hotshot crew." Matthew looked at her leg, then back at Jacob, who was devouring the food with heartbreaking speed. He asked quietly, "Billings." "I have?" It was a lie, and they both knew it. Matthew put his cup down. The clink of ceramic against the saucer sounded like a gavel. "You won't make it to Billings," Matthew said, his voice devoid of pity, but full of brutal fact. Nancy dropped her fork, her eyes flashing with a sudden spark of her old fire. "I didn't ask for your opinion, Mr. Gonzalez. I asked for a ride. We survived." Matthew leaned forward, and for the first time, the mask of indifference slipped, revealing a desperation that matched her own. "I know about survival. I've been surviving for 4 years, 3 months, and 2 days. He took a breath, glancing around the empty diner to ensure they were alone. "I have a proposition for you." "A job?" Nancy narrowed her eyes. Matthew shook his head, almost offended. "No, I need a wife." Nancy was stunned into silence. "You want to marry me?" Matthew looked out the window at the snow beginning to fall. "I know you walked 40 miles on a crippled leg to save your son. I know you sat in a warm car and fed him before you took a bite yourself. I know you have the eyes of someone who has walked through hell and kept going." He turned back to her, his gaze piercing. "I live alone in a house that has 20 rooms and too many ghosts. My family, my trustees, they think I'm unstable. They want to sell the ranch, dissolve the estate, put me in a facility because I haven't moved on since my wife and daughter died. If I have a family, a wife, a child, I stabilize my position. I keep my home. In exchange, you get a roof, medical care for your leg, a future for Jacob, and a trust fund that ensures he never goes hungry again. A business arrangement." The offer hung in the air. Insane. Impossible. And yet, staring at Jacob, who had fallen asleep with a half-eaten pancake in his hand, Nancy felt the walls of her resistance crumbling. She was a firefighter. She assessed risks. The risk of the road was death. The risk of this man was unknown. But looking at Matthew, she didn't see a threat. She saw a drowning man reaching for a piece of driftwood. She whispered, "Then I drive you to Billings, give you some cash, and hope you make it," Matthew said. She looked at her son, then at the snow swirling violently outside, erasing the world. She took a deep breath, the air shuddering in her lungs. "Okay," she said. The dining room was a cavern of mahogany and shadows. A chandelier that could have illuminated a ballroom was dimmed low, casting long, dancing silhouettes against the damask wallpaper. At one end of the table sat Matthew, nursing a glass of scotch that he hadn't taken a sip from in 20 minutes. At the other end, miles away, it seemed, sat Nancy. She had showered and changed into one of the simple dresses. Cynthia had grudgingly provided a navy blue wool that fit her surprisingly well, though she felt like an imposter in her own skin. "The lawyers will be here at 9 tomorrow, Matthew said, breaking the silence. His voice didn't echo. The room seemed to absorb it. Nancy looked up from her plate. She had barely touched the roast beef. Her stomach was still knotted tight from the adrenaline of the last 48 hours. "What are the terms, Matthew?" Matthew swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "It's a standard prenuptial agreement, heavily modified. You receive a monthly allowance of $5,000 for personal expenses. Jacob's education, health care, and future trust are separate and fully funded immediately upon the signing of the marriage license. If we divorce after 5 years, you leave with $2 million. If we divorce before that, Nancy put her fork down. The metal clattered against the fine china, a harsh sound in the quiet room. And I'm not talking about the money. I'm talking about us. Matthew finally looked at her, really looked at her. "You have your wing. I have mine. We share meals to maintain appearances for the staff and my sister. We attend charity functions once a month. In public, you are my wife. In private, you are..." Nancy asked, her voice steady. "He's 3, Matthew. He doesn't understand wings or guests. He needs a home." Matthew flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of the corner of his eye, but Nancy saw it. "He is a child," Matthew said roughly. "He can run where he wants. Just keep him out of the West Wing. The nursery, the shrine," Nancy corrected softly. Matthew slammed his glass down. "It is not a shrine. It is my private space." Nancy didn't flinch. She had stared down fire chiefs, and she had stared down walls of flame. A rich man with a broken heart didn't scare her. "We have an understanding about the rooms." "Matthew?" Matthew blinked, surprised. "I'm not a trophy," Nancy said, leaning forward. "And I'm not a ghost. I will not hide in my room while you drink yourself into a stupor. If I live here, I work here. I'm fixing the fire safety systems there. Outdated. I'm clearing the deadwood near the stables. It's a hazard. She paused, her eyes locking onto his. And one more thing. You don't get to look at my son like he's a painful memory. If you can't look at him with kindness, don't look at him at all. That's the deal. For a long minute, the only sound was the crackle of the fireplace. Matthew's expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. Then, slowly, the tension drained from his shoulders. A ghost of a smile, not happy, but impressed, touched his lips. He murmured, "I still am," Nancy replied. Matthew picked up his glass, raised it in a mock toast, and finally took a drink. "Dio, you can fix the alarms." Nancy. The iron gates of the Gonzalez ranch towered over the vehicle like the entrance to a fortress, the heavy metal wrought into twisting vines that seemed to warn rather than welcome. As the Range Rover climbed the winding driveway, Nancy saw the estate for the first time. It was a sprawling masterpiece of timber and stone, nestled against the base of the mountains, surrounded by thousands of acres of pine forest blanketed in fresh snow. It was beautiful, breathless, and terrifyingly lonely. Jacob woke up as the car stopped, his eyes widening at the size of the house. He mumbled sleepily. "Something like that, buddy," Nancy whispered, fighting the urge to tell Matthew to turn around. She was a woman who knew how to breach doors with a Halligan bar, but walking through this front door felt like stepping onto a crumbling roof one wrong move, and she would fall into the abyss. They were met in the grand foyer, not by a warm hearth, but by Cynthia Ramirez, Matthew's older sister. She was a woman of sharp angles and tailored silk, holding a tablet like a shield. She looked at Matthew, then at Nancy in her worn flannel and dirty tactical boots, and finally at Jacob, with a gaze that could freeze boiling water. "Matthew," she said, her voice clipped and precise, "you went to town for supplies and came back with—" Matthew's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "Cynthia, this is Nancy, my fiancée, and this is her son, Jacob." The silence that followed was absolute. Cynthia didn't yell. She simply blinked, a slow, predatory movement. "I see," she said, her tone dripping with venomous skepticism. "Another one of your episodes. Then it's not madness," Matthew said, his voice low and dangerous. "We are getting married at the courthouse on Friday. Prepare the guest suite in the east wing. And Cynthia..." Cynthia turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. Nancy felt a cold knot in her stomach. She had fought wildfires that were more welcoming than this woman. But Matthew turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Ignore her. She protects this family's legacy like a bulldog, but she knows who signs the checks." The marriage ceremony 3 days later was a sterile, bureaucratic affair. No white dress, no flowers, just signatures on legal documents that bound Nancy's destitute reality to Matthew's empire. But true to his word, Matthew provided. Jacob had a room filled with toys he was too shy to touch, new clothes, and nutritious food prepared by a cook who was far kinder than Cynthia. Nancy had a physical therapist coming twice a week for her leg, yet the house was a collection of silos. Matthew spent his days in his study or riding out to the far pastures, returning only for silent dinners where the clinking of silverware was the only conversation. Nancy, used to the camaraderie of a firehouse, felt the isolation acutely. She tried to make herself useful, her firefighter instincts kicking in. She fixed a loose railing on the veranda, cleared the snow from the emergency exits, and reorganized the first aid kits she found scattered and expired. She needed to feel capable, not just like a charity case. It was during one of her patrols of the house, 2 weeks in, that she found the room. It was at the end of the west wing, the door slightly ajar. Inside, it was a shrine. Unchanged, preserved in amber. A woman's vanity with perfume bottles gathering dust. A crib in the corner. Photos everywhere, Matthew younger, smiling with a light in his eyes that was now extinguished, holding a baby girl, his arm around a beautiful laughing woman. Nancy felt like an intruder, but she also felt a profound ache of recognition. She knew this room. It was the physical manifestation of the hole in her own heart where Mark used to be. Matthew found her there. She expected him to rage, to throw her out. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, looking defeated. "Her name was Julia," he said, his voice breaking, "and the baby was Emily. We lost control on the ice. 4 years ago, I survived." Nancy turned to him. tears in her eyes. I couldn't save Mark. She confessed the words she hadn't spoken to anyone, tumbling out. I was right there, Matthew. 5 feet away, the beam came down, and I was the one who was supposed to save everyone. For the first time, the distance between them collapsed. They weren't billionaire and beggar. They were 2 survivors standing in the wreckage of their pasts. Matthew walked over and, hesitatingly, reached out to wipe a tear from her cheek. His hand was rough, warm. "We are still here, Nancy," he whispered. That night, the dinner was less silent. Jacob made Matthew smile by trying to balance a spoon on his nose. It was a small crack in the ice, but it was there. But the fragile piece was shattered a week later. A blizzard, the worst in a decade, slammed into Montana. The power lines went down, plunging the estate into darkness, relying on backup generators. The roads were impassable, drifts of white death, and in the middle of the howling wind, Jacob woke up screaming. Nancy rushed to him, her heart hammering. He was burning up. His skin was dry and hot, his breathing shallow and rapid, a terrifying wheezing sound coming from his small chest. Pneumonia or RSV? Nancy grabbed her medical kit, her hands steady despite her fear. She checked his vitals. High fever. Low oxygen, she screamed, her voice echoing through the dark house. Matthew appeared in seconds, a flashlight in hand. "He can't breathe," Nancy gasped. "We need a doctor." Matthew ran to the phone, but the lines were dead. The satellite phone was getting no signal in the storm. "I can't drive him out," Matthew said, panic rising in his eyes, the same panic from the night of his accident. "The roads are gone, Nancy." Cynthia appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a robe, her fascie Polly. Nancy yelled, snapping into command mode. "I need cool water, now. Cynthia, get me alcohol, wipes, and towels. Matthew, I need you to help me elevate him. For the next 6 hours, the mansion became a field hospital. The hostility, the class divide, the contracts, it all evaporated. There was only the fight for a child's life." Nancy worked with a ferocity that awed them. She was no longer the limping woman. She was a first responder. She mixed improvised saline. She monitored his pulse. She cooled his body with methodical precision. But Matthew was the one who surprised her. He held Jacob for hours, rocking him, whispering stories about horses and mountains, his voice steady even as tears streamed down his face. He wasn't just fulfilling a contract. He was terrified of losing another child. He was looking at Jacob not as an asset, but as a son. Around 4 a.m., Jacob's breathing hitched, then stopped for a terrifying second. "Come on, baby!" "Breathe," Nancy pleaded, performing chest compressions with her thumbs on the tiny torso. Matthew gripped Jacob's hand, his knuckles white. "Don't you dare leave us, Jacob," he commanded, his voice cracking. "I just found you." And then a gasp, a cough, a cry. Jacob's lungs cleared, the wheeze loosening into a wet, productive cough. The fever broke, sweat drenching his small pajamas. Nancy collapsed back against the headboard, sobbing with relief. Matthew buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Even Cynthia, standing by the door with a basin of water, let out a shaky breath and wiped her eyes. They had fought death in the dark. On this Chimi, unlike in their pasts, they had won. The morning sun that broke over the Gonzales ranch was blindingly bright, reflecting off 4 feet of pristine snow. The storm had passed, leaving the world silent and cleansed. Inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The rigid lines of demarcation between employer and employee, between family and intruder, had been erased during the long, dark night. Jacob was sleeping peacefully, his color returned, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that Nancy watched like a hawk. She was sitting in the armchair by his bed, exhausted but wired, when Cynthia walked in. The older woman held a silver tray with a teapot and 2 cups. She set it down quietly and poured a cup, handing it to Nancy. There was no sneer, no judgment. "You have training," Cynthia said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. "I was a lieutenant," Nancy replied, taking the tea. Cynthia looked at Jacob. "Then, Nancy, I owe you an apology," she said stiffly, the words tasting foreign in her mouth. "I thought you were a gold digger, a grifter taking advantage of my brother's broken heart. But last night, you didn't fight for money. You fought for life. And you let Matthew help." She paused, her voice softening. "He hasn't looked at anyone like that since Emily died. You brought him back from the dead, Nancy. For that, you have my respect." Cynthia didn't wait for a reply. She simply nodded and left, leaving the door open, a symbolic gesture that wasn't lost on Nancy. Matthew entered the room an hour later. He looked haggard, his stubble thick, his eyes red-rimmed, but there was a lightness to his step. He sat on the edge of the bed and touched Jacob's forehead, checking the temperature instinctively. "He's cool," Matthew whispered. He turned to Nancy, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath hitch. "We need to talk." Nancy's heart sank. Now that the crisis was over, would he revert to the cold businessman? "Okay," she said, bracing herself. "If you want us to leave once the roads are clear, I understand. I have some money saved now. I can stop," Matthew interrupted, reaching out to take her hands. His grip was firm. "I don't want you to leave. Nancy, last night, when I thought we were losing him, I didn't care about the estate. I didn't care about the trustees or the legacy. I only cared about him." He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb tracing the scars on her knuckles. "I made this deal because I wanted to fill a void. I was selfish. I wanted a prop family to keep my ghosts at bay. But this isn't a prop. You aren't a prop. I fell in love with you, Nancy, not because you're grateful or because you need me, but because you are the bravest person I have ever met. You walked into this frozen tomb of a house and you lit a fire in the hearth." Nancy looked at this man, this millionaire who could buy anything in the world, but who had needed her, a broken firefighter with nothing but a backpack, to teach him how to live again. She realized that she had stopped thinking of the ranch as a shelter weeks ago. It had become home. And Matthew wasn't just a benefactor, he was the partner she thought she'd never find again. "I'm not easy, Matthew," she warned, tears spilling over. "I have nightmares. My leg might never be right." Matthew smiled, a true, dazzling smile that reached his eyes. "I have a big house," he said. "Plenty of room for baggage. Marry me, Nancy. For real this time, not for the contract." Nancy leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't the tentative, polite kiss of their wedding day. It was deep, desperate, and full of promise. It was the kiss of two survivors who had finally found their safe harbor. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. 3 years later. The summer sun was warm on the meadows of the Gonzalez Ranch. A barbecue was in full swing. Nancy stood on the porch, her leg much stronger now thanks to surgery and therapy, leaning against the railing. She was wearing a sundress, her firefighter boots long since retired. Though she now ran the County S Volunteer Emergency Coordination Center, a job Matthew had helped her set up, she watched the chaos in the yard with a contented smile. Jacob, now 6, was chasing a golden retriever, his laughter ringing out clear and bright, and running behind him with a toddler's determined waddle was Sophie, 2 years old, with Matthew's dark hair and Nancy Essie fierce eyes. Matthew walked up behind Nancy, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "They're fast," he noted, watching his children. Nancy laughed, leaning back into him. She turned in his arms, looking up at him. The shadows were gone from his face. The thousand-jawed stare had been replaced by a look of profound peace. "You saved me, you know," she told him, as she often did. Matthew kissed her forehead. "We were both lost, Nancy." They stood there, watching the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple colors of fire. But this cheamy fire that warmed instead of destroyed. The road that had brought them together was still out there, long and winding. But they didn't need to walk it anymore. They were home.